The prevalence of pornography has really transformed the relationships with sexes in ways that we as a society hasn't really thought about, and we had no control over. It was all determined by the tech gods.
Howdy, everyone. Welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the president of American Moment, and I'm joined by Nick, but he is not here for the intro and outro, but he will be here for the main episode, and we have a fantastic episode for you guys today. As always, be sure to check out everything we have cooking at AmericanMoment.org other than this fantastic podcast. Again, we're like almost 50 episodes of backlog content, so there's tons to look at there, especially if you're road tripping this spring. But more importantly, the Fellowship for American Statecraft, one of our flagship programs, the application for that is live and it's coming up towards its end. So make sure that you apply for that if you're a young person who wants to get their first job in D.C., placed at a Senate Hill office or a House office or a public policy organization and get paid to do it. That program is for you. We don't require any establishment credentials, whether it's an Ivy League education or really any college education at all. We're just looking for people who are aligned with us, who are driven, and who want to fight. So that's AmericanMoment.org/fellowship. And be sure to rate and review this podcast. It really helps us out. Share it on social media platforms. We're on a lot of them. We're on Rumble as well. I think we have a Getter account, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter. Just be sharing our content. It really helps. On most places you can find us at ammoment.org. Our guest today is someone brilliant, someone we look up to for a very long time. We have on Professor Adam Candeub, who's a professor of law at Michigan State University, where he directs its intellectual property, information, and communications law program. Under the Trump administration, he served as the acting assistant secretary of Commerce for telecommunications and information and the deputy associate attorney general. He headed up something called the NTIA. Prior to entering academia, he worked at private law firms and the Federal Communications Commission, and he was a law clerk to J. Clifford Wallace on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. He has been one of the longest critics of big tech on Section 230, on Antitrust. He has been one of the most entrepreneurial and interesting people fighting on this issue for a very long time. He's also a fellow at the Center for Renewing America, a senior fellow there, and is doing great work with our friends Russ Vogt, who we interviewed last season on the podcast and who recently celebrated the 1-year anniversary of their organization, as we have as well. So be sure to check out his work at renewingamerica.org. Unfortunately, you can't find him on social media, but we had a fantastic discussion about Section 230, yes, antitrust, yes, but also just more broadly about human flourishing in the digital age and how we actually reconcile these extremely disruptive technologies with a genuinely conservative way of living. There's always some wholesome libertarian bashing poked in there, but also some discussion of ways that we may be able to partner with libertarians in order to really reconcile the existing order, the nexus of private and corporate power that exists, especially in the digital space, with things that we all care about, the thriving of small business and so on. And so be sure to check out the episode. It's a great one, and I think you'll really enjoy it. And thank you guys for listening as always. And so we'll go now to Adam Candeub and Nick Solheim, who will be during the episode talking as well. Thank you guys for listening. We'll go now to Adam. Adam, thank you for coming on the podcast.
It's a real pleasure.
We always like to start with how people got to the point where they are today. You have a very interesting history on the issues you've been involved in and the way that your career has gone. Tell us the story of how you became the person you are today, involved in everything that you are.
Well, I started as a lawyer in D.C., like a lot of people, and I worked in private law firms and also in the FCC for a while. I'm back in private law firms, mostly concentrating on communications and antitrust law. And then I got a position in academia, and I've been a professor at Michigan State University for coming on 20 years. So early on, I sort of took a different point of view when it comes to some communications issues that became important, such as Section 230. I became one of the few academics that really was very much against what that provision would become, which would become a sort of immunity for the major platforms to deplatform people, and I thought it was a threat to free speech. I think as early as 2016, you begin to see that the Silicon Valley had emerged as arbiters of what is true and good and right in our society, and no one elected them, and they in fact represent a very sort of parochial minority, and that became to me a very important issue. So I began to write about it, and then one day out of the blue I get a call from White House personnel asking me if I want to get involved in the National Telecommunications and Information Authority. And in fact, I have a background in it. I mean, I'm an expert in that sounds pompous, but
you are. We grant you the title of expert.
Yeah, great. In communications law, I've spent 20 years doing telecom. I'm familiar with spectrum issues. So it was something that seemed really interesting. And I said, sure, I'll give it a try. Why not? And I started out there as deputy, and to my surprise, out of the blue, President Trump revived the executive order on Section 230, and so all of a sudden NTIA became the center of this of those issues at the time. And I later was made acting administrator of NTIA, and then in the last month or so of the Trump administration, I moved over to justice as Deputy Associate Attorney General.
So to kind of lay the groundwork for our listeners who may not be super familiar with Section 230, aside from all the libertarians screaming about it on Twitter, what is Section 230? How does it apply to a lot of these big tech companies? How should conservatives be thinking about it?
Yeah, the way libertarians talk about it, I believe it was handed down by Moses, written in stone tablets 2,000 years ago. Is that right?
The 11th commandment.
Yeah, the 11th. Well, it's really a terribly misunderstood and statute, and I'm happy to talk about it. But also, I think conservatives should remember it's a sideshow, in the sense that it's very important. It should be reformed, but the bigger issue is that we have these huge tech platforms that just exercise a disproportionate power in our society, and that's really the main problem we have to get at. But yeah, but getting to Section 230. So Section 230 started as really an effort to encourage platforms to get rid of pornography. I mean, if you look, it was part of the Communications Decency Act, and there are two parts of it. One of which was declared unconstitutional, but 230 survived, and 230 said, look. If you read the congressional record, there are all these congressmen and senators getting very exercised about pornography. It's hard to remember. In fact, I imagine you guys don't because you're so young. But in the 1990s, it was a horrifying thing that 14 or 15-year-old Johnny could import into his bedroom all the pornography in the world. This was a very different sort of phenomena that people have experienced before, and people were rightly upset. I think they should be rightly upset. I think the prevalence of pornography has really transformed the relationships with sexes in ways that we as a society hasn't really thought about, and we had no control over. It was all determined by the tech gods. So the problem was at the time, the 1990s. Again, this is ancient history for you. Right after they started writing in cuneiform, we had dial-up internet, and this is what the congressmen and senators were thinking about in the age of AOL and Prodigy, and they were walled gardens, if you remember, and they had bulletin boards. And there was this one case that said, look, Prodigy is advertising itself as a family-friendly internet service provider. So they're going to edit all the bulletin boards to take rid of the dirty words and bad words and dirty pictures. And there's one case that said, look, if Prodigy does that, then it's going to be legally liable for the entire bulletin board. So all the libel or defamation or criminal threats, they will be liable for. And of course, the ISP industry didn't like that ruling. So what did they do? They went to Congress and said, get us a new law. And thus they were given Section 230. And Section 230 said, look, if you take down dirty pictures, it's, obscene, lewd, lascivious, extremely violent, or harassing, you're not responsible for your whole platforms. And that's what it was about. That's all it was about. It was to say, look, if these walled gardens want to kick out porn, they're not going to be liable for every comment on their bulletin boards. But what it's become, thanks to some really bad court rulings, which I think Justice Thomas in a last year in a recent statement on certiorari pointed out, it's become a get out of jail free for liability for anything. So they can kick you off and they can deplatform you on the basis of your race or religion. They're immune from civil rights law. They're immune from even contract law, thanks to Section 230. So that has to be reformed. But to me, in a way, that's a sideshow. And, the real more important issue is, can we as a society re-exert ourselves over the central sort of nervous system of our society so we can understand how ideas are being exchanged and make sure that it's truly reflective of American society.
So I find that question very interesting, and I'm heartened to hear you zoom out on that, because the conversations in D.C. often seem so parochial when it comes to just Section 230. And I think that conservatives should care about it, but only insofar as the conversation is about human flourishing in the digital age more broadly. And it seems like that's how you're thinking about it as well. So we had on a fellow by the name of Antonio Garcia Martinez a couple of weeks ago on the podcast, and he, I think, he was literally responsible for designing the technology that eventually became targeted advertising. And he essentially had the line that the tail wagging the dog over the last 30 years has been technological innovation, and the story is DC catches up to it. That policy, at least the way that it's made in the United States, really doesn't have a way to either the willingness, capability, or really ability to shape the way that digital technology evolves. Do you think that's true? I mean, can policymakers actually do anything, or does Silicon Valley operate at a clip and a rapidity that the people in this town can never hope to match?
Well, I think Silicon Valley operates like all businesses, wealthy businesses, not necessarily with rapidity and clip, but with a checkbook that makes it very difficult to counter. Even as an academe, I go to academic conferences and I look out at my fellow academics, and I know a number of the most ardent supporters are getting nice little checks from Google or Facebook. And of course, if we go in the DC environment, it's even more so. So I don't know whether we have a political economy that can even address those questions. But I do think it's possible. What amazes me is that these questions have never been even asked. I imagine you gentlemen are not at the age of having kids, or started having kids, or
I mean, he may start soon.
Yeah, okay,
He's married.
Okay. Well, it's something that it took me by surprise. I mean, I have to admit, I have failure as a parent, but in many ways, parents are no longer raising their children as those friggin' screens. And because if you look at, if we consider education as a process of sort of coming up to your peers, moving up to expectations, becoming part of standards and reflecting yourself amongst people who are viewing you and judging you, it's not your parents who are doing it. It's not your teachers who are doing it. It's their TikTok communities. And we never really thought about that. We just said, okay. And, so people like, Jonathan Haidt, who's certainly no conservative, but, he points this out, that they've been profoundly destructive for children. Social media in particular is associated with obesity, depression, mental illness, particularly with young girls and with women and young girls. No, that's young women and girls. And we just don't care. And I think it also is a fault with us, because, it's so much easier to have your iPad parent your kids than you're doing it yourself. It's so much easier for teachers to say, oh, do this online exercise rather than actually lecture. And so like so much in big tech, they're able to sort of put their finger on our moral weaknesses and profit from it, and at the same time degrade all of society.
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting thought. I was just thinking about how Do you guys remember that like first big the big tech bill that Hawley had that but you know, part of what was included in it was like banning infinite scroll.
Yep.
And I remember at the time, I mean, conservatives, like basically as a monolith, almost all of them were against this. I mean, they were like, this is ridiculous. Like, you know, the fact that you should be able to or that you should be able to stop companies from providing you endless content and entertainment is crazy. That's not like conservative at all. And it's crazy for me to like spend time around young people who, because of, you know, the dopamine addiction, can't go for 20 minutes without like scrolling through something. I mean, of course, I'm talking about you, but you know, can't go 20 minutes, and also my wife, but can't go for 20 minutes, you know, without scrolling through Instagram, TikTok, or whatever. And I've been kind of using this anecdote. I know this family that lives in the same neighborhood as my wife and I, and they have 3 kids, and they have this rule in their house that for like during the work week, so, you know, for the 5 days of the week, there's no screens in their household for any of their kids. And then on the weekends, they like watch classic movies together. And I've been using this anecdote with, you know, a couple different like married folks. I mean, my wife and I are recently married, but we have a lot of friends who are married also, some who are just now having children. And the reactions have ranged from, you know, that doesn't go far enough, I want to live in like a Luddite cabin in the woods, to that's barbaric, this is the world that we live in now, you know, children should have that access. And I'm kind of reminded of when, you know, when Burke talks about liberty, you know, he says it's much easier to have complete and unadulterated liberty and freedom than it is to actually, you know, rule. Now he's talking about like, you know, ruling and pushing people towards a prosperous life through government, but I think the same principle applies to households,
Our personal
right?
lives, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's so much there, and I just on the last point, you're talking about rule of oneself, having discipline, control to focus and concentrate on, let's say, your studies or your work. Screens undermine that ability. They make people need distraction. They make people unable to concentrate, and especially with children, a profoundly negative effect. You know, getting back to the Hawley bill, yeah, I remember the reaction to it, and I remember reading it and thinking this is probably one of the most forward-looking bills ever, you know, introduced, because it recognizes that yes, there are profound behavioral consequences of our interaction with screens. And we don't really understand that. Getting back to your point, Saurabh, about how, you know, can we catch up with technology? That's an area I don't think we have. We don't really realize how our relationships with the screens have transformed who we are. And I think
because there's no control group.
There's no control.
Decided to deploy this en masse across the entire globe.
Especially on our kids. Yeah.
Maybe the Amish.
Maybe the Amish. Well, right, precise. But you know, it's funny. You think about the Amish, and I'm from actually suburban Pennsylvania, the exurbs of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. So I know a little bit about them, and you know, they're very thoughtful. So, for instance, when they had issues with actually a genetic syndrome that they had to sort of deal with, and you know, do with sort of figure out who was carrying it. You know, they were very welcoming of genetic science to figure out what was going on, but they sort of realized, look, you know, this sort of technology, whether it's television or motors or whatever, disrupts our culture, which is really the most important thing, which is bringing up kids to be like us. And we never have that thought at all. We're just like, oh, it's new, it's cool, yay. And I think it's very, very worrisome. And one last thing, getting back to, you know, conservatives and libertarians, you know, if we're honest about screens, they really disrupt all of those basic assumptions that we all get in microeconomics 101. You know, the clever kid in the class goes, well, you know, Professor, well, if utility is the measurement of all things, what about drug addicts who get utility from drugs? And then, you know, oh no, well, we won't worry about that. Oh, you know, Professor, well, you know, I may engage in this activity and I may enjoy for 2 hours, or 4 hours, but at the end of the day, I'm unhappy. Oh, don't worry about that. Utility is measured by consumption. We don't worry about happiness, things like that. And screens present those issues in a real way. And conservatives, are still in this old-fashioned libertarian framework where it's just like, well, if you're using it and you like it, and it's making people money, it must be good. I'm like, well, no, it's not.
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of that with like the porn debate. I mean, you brought that up initially, and I think there's social media and basically how it's melting our brains. I think I was kind of skeptical about this initially. I mean, when Hawley had this bill, I think it was 20. Well,
he got elected in 2018.
Yeah, so I think it was 2019. I was a little skeptical at first, but for the last year, I've not had any social media apps on my phone. I just got rid of them all. And you're
much happier, and you lost weight, and
seriously,
you're training for a marathon.
So I actually lost in 2020. I lost 70 pounds.
There you go.
Yeah, I got in shape, started reading. I read 57 books last year. I mean, it was crazy. But the thing that I notice is when I log into Twitter on my desktop, the next day I always have a headache. I'm not used to the dopamine anymore. Right. And so last night, I was scrolling Twitter on my iPad too late because of, the Russian-Ukrainian war. And this morning I'm like, man, I just feel like garbage. I didn't sleep well. I don't think I realized how, how much of a sway and power these social media companies have over our wellness.
Yeah.
So in your mind, what are some practical solutions aside from, outright banning infinite scroll, which we've already talked about a little bit, but that people can kind of reintroduce some kind of normal wellness into their lives?
Well, from a legislative perspective, I think the first place to start is with kids, because I think that's a place where legally we have the most ability, because there's a First Amendment exception for them. But one of the most basic things, something I've been working on at the Center for Renewing America, has been, I'll be very practical here. Mm-hmm. The so-called Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, and it has to be one of the worst statutes ever passed by Congress, because it does the opposite. I mean,
the august title of
Well, okay. I mean, that's a very competitive title. But I mean,
I was going to say there's been a lot.
Yeah, there's been a lot. Okay, so maybe it makes a short list. But I mean, the idea is that.
When was this passed, by the way?
This was in 1998.
Okay.
And the idea is that online firms should not be collecting information about our kids without our permission. And they do it all the time.
Didn't work.
It didn't work. Well, because it did the opposite. Essentially, it created this incredibly high standard for liability. It said that they could track. It only applied to children who were 13 and under. And then, of course, it then preempted all state laws privacy laws that could be used against the platforms. So it did the opposite of what it purported to do. It didn't protect children's privacy. It, in fact, made it impossible to protect. And so, a requirement, for instance, that, no social media company can have an account with a minor without, a signed notarized statement from their parents, which Facebook shall keep on file for inspection.
I don't recall that being a requirement when I made my Facebook account.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, but I mean, if you talk about a serious policy response, it's saying, look, hands off our kids. You don't. We have no problem saying that to Joe Camel. We had no problem saying that to the cigarette companies. Stop that. We should have the same gumption with the online platforms, because I think it's possible. Who knows? But I think it's within the realm of the possible that 30 years from now, we'll look at this. A your generation. It's like, what have we done? Well, not you, of course, yeah. but a huge number of lives that were somewhat stunted or not led as happily and completely as possible because they have been wasted on these ridiculous apps.
Yeah, I mean, brain chemistry is plastic, but only so much, right? And so, on the pornography topic as well, I know that one of the big statistics that people, child psychologists and such who look at this sort of thing is sort of age of first exposure. And if you can delay that as much as humanly possible, the benefits for children's ability to pair bond, to have healthy sex lives, to lead normal, well-functioning lives is dramatically improved. And it's relatively marginal. Like if you can just increase from 10 to 13, you can see dramatic benefits. Especially when it comes to prepubescent exposure. And I can't help but wonder, is technology addiction very similar to that? I was very lucky that even though I basically grew up, I was born in 1998. So when I was a child, it was essentially a choice that parents could make. Either your kid could be a screen kid or they may not. And I really screens became a much bigger part of my life by the time I was a teenager, but before that they really weren't. They were just part of my life. They weren't all of it. And I thank God every day that my parents had the wherewithal in order to do that, both when it came to the big screen in the form of television, the smaller ones in the form of video games, and certainly when it came to cell phones and such. But that's the last generation that's going to have that differential. And I know kids that are just a little bit younger than me who the iPad was practically the pacifier. And that's one of the most, look, I don't want to, publicly criticize parents in public who are, parenting, it's, God bless them for having kids at all. Cause that's not even a given these days. But, when I see like, a screaming child iPad, like that being the answer, it just seems inappropriate. And so, when it comes to delaying first exposure, unfortunately, for digital technology more broadly and the addictive cycle of digital technology, it seems much more complicated than just the narrow question of porn. It's how do you prevent children from being exposed to these dependency pathways that technology companies have essentially monetized systematically over the last 10 to 15 years. What would that look like? Because it's not just, I mean, at this point, the 13-year-olds don't want a Facebook account. What would it look like more broadly when it comes to digital technology to have a regulatory regime and a legal regime that actually protected kids from whatever the analogy to first exposure would be in this case?
To be honest, I'm not quite sure I know. Certainly having accounts for social media, as you point out, most kids today don't want Facebook accounts, but I think they want Instagram accounts. Maybe I'm wrong there. I don't know. You guys can.
They do. The TikTok's the actual problem, which we'll get to in a second. Which is back into the NTIA, which is something we tried to kick out of the United States, which would have been a great thing. But oh well, that was blocked by a federal judge. Thank you, judiciary. But it's a problem that requires thought, and nobody even is thinking about that. I mean, fundamentally, it is parents' job to make sure that these devices aren't in their kids' hands, or if they are, that they're monitored. But it has to be a social phenomenon too. So, for instance, I remember a conversation I had with a teacher and for my youngest, and the question was, should we get a fifth grader an iPhone? And her position was, well, yes, you should, because everyone else has it, and they will be socially isolated. And she won. I didn't want a socially isolated kid. It's burden enough having me as a dad. So, but that's a problem. I mean, that is a problem that is becoming expected in our society. Schools require it in a sense because I think the whole online movement in schools has been a disaster. I think learning through screens is terrible. And I think the teachers union loves it because it makes things easier. Administrators love it because it makes things easier and gives them more power. But of course, that's not what education is about. If you look at the private schools in Silicon Valley, they don't teach through screens. They teach the old Russian method of, teaching mathematics, and which obviously is good for some things, as we were learning out today. So, I think the first step really is to just
get it out of the schools and just say, look, we're not going to accept that. I mean, I look back and I sort of kicked myself and told the teacher, this is crazy. Why are you doing this? But I didn't. We're flawed. We don't realize things. But that will be the first step, I think. Pornography is a really difficult and interesting question. Michael Regnerus, are you familiar with him?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's done a lot of work, and, we're seeing a tremendous amount of sexual dysfunction in 20s and 30-year-olds. They're not marrying, they're not dating, they're not having sex. When I was younger, everyone was worried about premarital sex and children out of wedlock. Now we're just worried about having any children at all. Yeah. Which is worse?
A sick society or a dead one?
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Is it kids having kids out of wedlock, or is it kids not wanting to have kids? This is a problem, and I think a large portion of this has to do with this unexamined relationship we have with our screens, and we just need to know more.
Yeah. So I think an interesting question in all this is I've seen a lot of people kind of push back. I don't know. There's kind of been like two schools of thought with this. Like, one is that we just need to kind of withdraw from this online digital space entirely. I mean, again, kind of the Luddite view that like we just need to move to cabins in the woods. We need to pull our kids out of school, homeschool, not allow anyone to have phones.
And to be clear, we are very friendly and sympathetic to the Luddite view.
Correct. It is probably what I will end up doing in the next 5 years. But then there's also, some of the more people who are more on probably the realist or more like optimistic side of these things that say like we have to find a way to like live in balance, because if we just retreat from this digital sphere, I mean, it'll just go to hell and anarchy, and we'll be our little small communities in the woods, but our country will still be going to hell. So what do you like? How can conservatives be thinking about how to create a digital world that's balanced without fully just retreating from it entirely?
I mean, I don't think it's that difficult. We just create balanced people, and people who can say, "Well, that's
easy to say,
right?" Well, that's a simple answer. It's not a easily achieved answer, how do you do that? Well, you train kids to be interested in a bunch of things, not just on their screens. And, it's missing just disciplining time. Make sure they're outside, make sure they're reading, make sure they're helping you out, outside with chores or with, kitchen work or whatever. And that is a challenge because, the screen is the siren of our times. But people do it. I think it's possible. Going back to, I think one of the interesting things about balance, and I'll just share this from my personal experience. One of the things that made me much more negative about the possibility of humanity, let's put it that way, is how little we've done with the internet, in the sense that it's so extraordinary. I remember when I was growing up, getting books would be somewhat difficult. You go to the library, and I remember being disappointed. I couldn't find this book or that book, and I'd have to wait. No one has to wait anymore for any book. You can get any Shakespeare play performed on YouTube. Yeah. You can get any opera that you want. You can. It's all there, and nobody does it. Very few people. It's not as if
time preference really isn't operative anymore.
Exactly.
Society.
That's right. And we haven't seen this tremendous cultural flowering. We haven't seen. We've just seen TikTok. We've just gone immediately to the lowest level, and I don't know whether we can build up from that. But I just wanted to put that as a depressing aside on this. I think Thursday morning. I think
an interesting anecdote to add to that is I'm actually reading Senator Hawley's book on TR that he wrote in like 2008. Right. It's very good. Highly recommend it. We should put it on AmCanon. I'm not sure if it's on AmCanon. I'm going to talk to Jake about that. But he like talks about. I was just reading this morning and thinking about it that TR like over a summer in Germany learned like German, French, and like a smattering of Spanish by just like reading books. And I was sitting here thinking like, nobody would ever do that now. Like just spend a whole summer reading and learn like 3 languages,
Right. I mean, and again, I think that has to do with the nature of focus, because we're creatures that love to be diverted. We are constantly and if you have nothing to do, if there's no telephone and there's even no people around, you'll sit on your ass and you'll learn German, and we don't do to the opposite. Everything in our society goes the opposite way. And getting back to your notion of self-rule and Burkean government, are we just being hollowed out as people? To me, that's my greatest worry. I mean, as a professor, I guess all old guys look at young people's like, oh, but so I really wonder. I mean, I'm curious what you think about your peers. I mean, certainly it's not a criticism that you guys get, because you are leaders and our hope, but there seems to be something hollowed out in a lot of people today. Let's just put it that way. And I think it's largely this dependent nature. I can't, if I don't have the screen, I won't be diverted. I won't know what to do with myself, and that creates a panic and weakness in people. So
no, I think that's all right. And I want to go to the kind of macro forces that allowed it to get like this, because it feels like in another era it never should have gotten this bad. And the reason why is because Silicon Valley and digital technology, specifically around the consumer internet, has a sweetheart deal regulatorily that allows it to operate at a pace and with an addictiveness that no business in the world of atoms, as opposed to the world of bits, would ever be able to get away with, because we have a legal tradition and a regulatory tradition, and also just a downstream political culture that understands what to do with very addictive substances. We understand how to regulate drugs. We just did it with Juul. We know we have the muscle memory in order to talk about it, but we don't have it with Silicon Valley. And so talking about this is I think very foreign to conservatives, because it is only the left that thinks in terms of theories of governance today. The right has no such thing, and it has no way of actually considering what a legal regime for the digital age would look like. Again, you can't get conservatives in this town on the same page on even Section 230, maybe one of the most minor changes we could make. It would have obviously a large impact, but it's marginal, and you can even frame it as a deregulatory thing if you really want to. And so going back to Section 230, because it does seem like one of the things that allowed for specifically consumer social media companies to proliferate dramatically. Can you describe the trajectory after 1998 that allowed it to create this massive explosion in social media companies?
Yeah. So, and getting back to your point, which I think is absolutely right, Saurabh, is that Silicon Valley moved too fast. It transformed too quickly, and regulation never caught up. So, the earliest television regulation goes back to the 1930s. I mean, when it was a theoretical technology, but already the FCC was there with its FDR's FCC was there with getting its little finger in, we had a much greater sense of control. I'm warming up to your question.
No, please.
And I remember one of the first jobs I got as a young, sort of cub attorney was dealing with violence on broadcast television in the 1990s. And it's ancient history. It seems quaint, but there were all these groups that were very concerned about violence on television, and they would present these very elaborate studies where we exposed 100 fifth grader boys to Starsky and Hutch, and the other 100 to Masterpiece Theater, and the first one they played much more violently on the playground. This is a problem. But I'm being facetious, but you get my. But the idea is that there was much greater sense of control. It's like, okay, this is an issue and government plays a role here. When Section 230 was passed in there was no social media. There was no internet there was no World Wide Web. I mean, it just started in 1995. I mean, for most people. I remember when I'm a friend of mine, a computer scientist, like, I have to try this out. It's really cool, Adam. Because before the internet...
And you're like, this is going to ruin my life.
Yeah.
Well, and specifically Michigan State, where you now teach, was a big epicenter for this.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah. And so, before, everything was much more command line. Getting online was more difficult. I mean, I remember with AOL, it took forever to, make sure your protocols were correct and correctly set. And all of a sudden it became very easy. So, 230 was not passed in the world of social media, but it made social media possible because it said, look, guys, you can make money essentially allowing people... Can I say that word?
Yeah,
okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Essentially able to say...
It's a term of art.
It's a term of art, that's right. And say nasty things about people and gossip and bring up all the black of their id, and you don't have any liability. And this was unique.
And practically speaking, from a business model, I have tech friends that have used the term tech in a pretty interesting way. They say really what defines a modern tech company, especially in the eyes of venture capital and financiers, is having a cost per customer acquisition of essentially zero, because the customers are your product essentially. Right. And so these companies didn't have to produce anything. They just had to attract people that would then produce the things that make them valuable. And that's very different than the way we traditionally think about commerce. And yeah, please continue.
Yeah, no, exactly. People never sort of, you remember the old AOL and Prodigy, you paid for the subscription. And all of a sudden...
We don't remember.
Well, yeah, okay. Your parents paid for the subscription. And all of a sudden it was flipped, and nobody even realized that, okay? So we went from a subscription to essentially broadcast television model before anyone could even blink an eye. And then all of a sudden, we had social medias that could exercise this incredible power. So you're right. It simply moved too fast. And I mean, to me, one of the most disturbing parts about it is that, it's moved so fast that it's really sort of taken away the ability to respond because it's so rich and because it controls so much of what happens in the city right now. Yeah. So,
well, I think a very interesting part of all this too is the difference in internet and technology use between the generations. So, you're talking about this kind of so my parents met on AOL.
Romantic.
living in different states back when the internet was just chat rooms. That was it. My mom, I think, was 16 and my dad was 17. She lived in Arkansas. My dad lived up in northern Minnesota, and so they met online, but then they switched to phone calls and they called each other for 2 years and got married. So there's 19 years between me and my mom and 20 between me and my dad. And the way that they use the internet, and my dad was in IT for years. My parents are missionaries now, but the difference in the way that they use internet and the way that I use the internet or that my peers use the internet is insane. I mean, they met on it, but they're using it to go back to college and get a seminary degree. Whereas we're, as you said, posting on on TikTok or on Instagram or in my case on Twitter. And it's just insane to me that it's moved so fast. I mean, you were talking about earlier, Saurabh, people a couple of years younger than you just have a completely different outlook on technology, how the role that it's played in their lives. C.S. Lewis has this quote about society creating men without chess, right?
There's a Greek word for it. I forget something. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
But I almost feel like that's what we've created. I mean, men, as leaders of society who are not capable of, because everything is brought and served to them, through the internet. Men are not used to having to go and get things anymore or to attain a certain amount of, I know I'm just ranting at this point, but obtain a certain amount of power or strength to be able to go get certain things. I mean, now you can just drop ship things on Amazon to make $1 million a year or whatever.
Right. No. I mean, I think that's, I think that's a profound point in the sense that one, not only does it make people weak, but it makes people demanding of their authority, whether it's Amazon Prime, whether it's their online professor, whether the idea is I just sit here and things should come to me, and when they don't, I get angry. At the same point, it makes people fearful.
That's why people are entirely willing to shoot Canadian truckers in the head because their Amazon deliveries are getting delayed.
Well, there's a flip side. There's a fear to it because I'm not a particularly good mechanic, but the older cars, if something could go wrong, it could be fixed. I think maybe. I mean, certainly. But newer cars, I can't do it. I mean, I don't know what the hell is going on there. And I think that's a sort of metaphor for all of society, in the sense that we don't have a sense of control
or skills
or control. And I think that goes to the idea of manliness, because I think notions of competence and that's one of the things that men like to pride themselves. We can do this. And an online environment, it's like, no, you're totally passive. You can't do anything unless Papa Amazon decides or Google Goddess lets you. And I think that's a very debilitating psychological phenomenon.
Yeah, it's interesting that so now is my turn to sound a little pompous. I have a lot of male.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
I'm a professor. It's an occupational hazard.
I have a lot of male friends that come to me for how do I do X, Y, or Z thing, because I grew up in the third world most of my teenage years without internet or without a cell phone. I mean, I worked on a hog farm, and so and I worked with my dad on a hydroelectric power plant. So I just learned how to do little physical things with your hands. And it has been shocking to me over the last couple of years, especially in D.C., where everyone's hands are soft and they give weak handshakes, where they don't know how to do anything, much of anything, because all they've had to do is type on a computer screen. That's right. And that's it.
The online environment gives us the illusion that we don't have bodies, but the point is we do have bodies, and it's most obvious in things like sexual relationships, and the screens are disrupting that because you just look at the numbers and they're very discouraging, and that of course leads to unhappiness because we're connected beings, and the numbers for mental illness for teenagers and people in their 20s and 30s, the numbers of people that are on pharmaceutical, psychotropics, it's insane from my perspective. And it's one of these it's just not examined. And I think there's probably a real connection between that sort of dislocation of self. So
the most extreme example of this, and really it seems like the apex of the worst of what social media has to offer appears to be TikTok. Can you walk us through a little bit of what makes TikTok unique vis-a-vis these other platforms, and then specifically the fight during the Trump administration to potentially solve some of those problems and why it ultimately failed?
Well, TikTok is a frightening thing. Why in the world do we want, a company that is essentially run by the Chinese Communist Party collecting information about all of us, particularly our children, encouraging them to waste their time when they could be studying? And why would we want this? If this were the Soviet Union, if this were Putin's thing, I'm sure everyone would be against it. And I think that was one of the really great things about the Trump administration. He saw that the true strategic threat to the United States and the entire Western world was China, and actually was willing to take some steps to do something. And it's unquestionable that TikTok is used to get information about American society, and that this information, like virtually all information by Chinese companies, is shared with the government. We were totally within our prerogatives to ban it. Of course, social media companies appealed this to a liberal judge in California, and these orders were thrown out after a huge amount of work and effort. What can one say? It's just, where are our priorities as a nation, that we're getting situations like this. But yeah, I look back at it and I think of the work that was put into it. And it's very discouraging. I'm not going to lie about that.
Can you describe a little bit concretely what the mechanism that the Trump administration was pursuing and what exactly they were trying to get it to do? Because to me, this is a perfect, it actually may be, I don't know what the long-term view on this is going to be. I think it may be one of the biggest failures or missed opportunities during the Trump administration, because it may have been the last opportunity to prevent. TikTok is now the number one website in the world. It surpassed Google. It was number 7 last year, and it was, 2 years ago, and it was number 1 last year. And so there was a real opportunity in 2020 to potentially do something about this. So what was the exact mechanism that the Trump administration was pursuing in order to rein it in and to ameliorate some of these concerns?
Well, it had to do with certain statutes which essentially allow the federal government to prevent foreign entities that pose a threat to national security from getting information about the United States, about U.S. citizens, essentially, broadly speaking, anti-espionage statutes. It did require sort of pushing the boundaries a little bit and using it in a new way. It required coordination amongst various treasury and commerce and various aspects of government. But yeah, it basically goes to statutes that prohibit foreign interference in American society and essentially hostile countries from espionage, really. I'm not using it in the technical term, but essentially that was that. And so there was, in the Trump administration, there were, it was, WeChat and TikTok, there were extensive efforts to essentially say, look, you can't offer your facility here. I'm just like, sorry, it just like China does not allow Facebook or Google in China, we're not going to let you offer these platforms because they're used primarily to obtain information about U.S. citizens and you're a hostile power. This was not, and so it was passed and went into effect for like 6 hours, and then Silicon Valley and their high-priced lawyers got a injunction from a California federal judge, and then of course the Biden administration dropped all of it, and just, we're not interested. Too bad. Go ahead, TikTok. And the Biden administration could have continued the litigation. It could have pursued the orders. It just dropped it like a hot potato. And it's just essentially saying, China, come on in, welcome. And I won't mince words. It's one of the most depressing consequences of the election.
One of our former guests on the show, Terry Schilling, has posted some on Twitter about how, like, he's on TikTok, which I think is deeply unfortunate. But he posts about how frequently, he's married, he's a dad, but was posting about how frequently just like random extremely sexual content shows up on TikTok. And I was seeing another article about this too, that shame on me for reading an article, but that the amount of like sexual content that's getting, and like almost like borderline pornographic content getting recommended to American users is just increasing and increasing. And I think this is an interesting concept, especially juxtaposed with China's kind of resistance against some of the Western cultural malaise. What do you think about like are Chinese users allowed to see some of this like pornographic content? Do you think it's something they're specifically trying to do to hurt the West, or is it just we're really messed up and so the algorithms are making us more messed up?
No, look, I don't know what it's actually like in China, but what you read is that Chinese children are prohibited from, is it 3 hours a week of video games? They have a surveillance web in which everyone is carefully monitored as what they watch, and they are very, very concerned that how the internet is affecting their children. Do I think that they're playing a game of trying to of cultural pollution? I think it's very possible. Why wouldn't they? I mean, if you believe that you are, if you believe that you are in a, like I imagine the Chinese Communist Party does, that they are in an adversarial relationship with the rest of the world, and they would like to become top dog. Of course, let's weaken the moral fiber of our enemies, and that's a very effective way. I can't imagine that has not been thought up at the highest levels in the Communist Party in China. Yeah, of course it has. I suspect. Of course it has. I suspect. I shouldn't. But yeah, and it makes sense. The fact that we can't react to that does speak to a weakness in our society. With the fact that we can and we don't. I mean, I imagine 50 years ago, churches, schools, communities would have been able to say no, and would have been able to say, we were a more cohesive society. We could say no. For whatever reason, we can't right now. And I'm not sure why that's the case, but we're not doing it.
Yeah. One of the arguments that a lot of the American big tech companies are now marshaling, sensing, anti-China grand strategy sentiment in D.C. is, you can't do antitrust against us because now the choice is between American platforms and Chinese platforms. What do you make of that argument? It all seems a little too clever by half. B, do you think that is going to be a growing vector to avoid the antitrust policies that both conservatives and liberals have been looking at over the last few years?
I think that's going to be a very powerful rhetorical tool that is going to be used. It's not as if Google or Facebook is a really important provider of defense technology. Essentially, it's a telephone company.
Yeah.
And furthermore, it's a telephone company that so what if we're not the world leader in social media? I mean, I think there's other technologies that and other pursuits which are probably better for us to be in. I think one of the real problems we have right now is that Google and Facebook are sucking up our brilliant engineers. I mean, they should be going into material science. They should be going into precision engineering. They should be going into nuclear, God forbid. But yes, no. Instead, they're doing emoticons on Facebook, and I'm fine with saying I don't think it's a horrible Dirigi's thing to say. It's like, look, we have enough investment in social media. Let them be eaten up by TikTok, in at least not in this country, but in Europe. I don't care if the Europeans are watching TikTok or whatever, and that's fine. I mean, France just said no to Facebook. And with Germany, it's not the end of the world. And I don't think that these are industries that we should fall on our swords for. In a way, I think it's destructive to have them so rich and so powerful that they're actually sucking up talent that should be going elsewhere.
So walk us through what is the theory of antitrust, of breaking up these tech companies that you believe in, and how could that process in a stepwise way be done over the next couple of years, and ideally under a Republican president and a conservative governance, but even maybe without it?
Right. Well, first, I mean, I will say, as conservatives, I think the first issue is the type of legislation that Hawley presented and it's now in Haggerty has as well, that we have to have protection of conservative speech on the platforms. I think that's first before even we get to antitrust, because if we don't have that, we're just going to be crushed. We will be silenced. We will be marginalized. So I think some sort of requirement that the platforms stop their discrimination and censorship of conservative voices is essential. Second, I do think we have to consider antitrust, and that's going to be a science, and that's going to be difficult. I mean, I think that a lot of them do have to be broken up, certainly. And in a way, I think, and I know I sound very old-fashioned in this, but in a way that sort of protects small businesses. I think the Republican Party's future is with small businesses. So for instance, Amazon, let's break up its sales platform from its distribution platform. And now I know, I mean, the missiles are coming over from Bezos's mansion right now. But you think about, I think I would talk about Google and the social media platforms. I will, but you think about a technology, which is wonderful. We all love it. Okay. We all love Amazon Prime. We all like getting that crap. But it's been so destructive toward just the basic fabric of life because people don't go to stores. They don't see each other. And as well as essentially, totally destroying a gazillion American businesses. Now, of course, the economists are going to say, well, everybody's happy, fat and lazy sitting in their homes. And that may be true. But at the very least, it may be true, but we could still have a type of antitrust solution where Amazon isn't sitting on all the retailers with all of the data and then saying, oh, you're a successful retailer. Now we're going to have a special deal with you. And that's a problem because essentially it crushes all innovation because that if you're a clever retailer, you have a new idea, all of your rents will essentially be extracted by Amazon. And, we want to protect little guys. And I think that as we move, as conservatives, find a place in antitrust, I think it has to be with protecting small businesses. And, the people from AEI and our libertarian friends who will say, oh, it's so wasteful. It's like, we have to say, no, there's a social benefit for people engaged in creative capitalist activity, which is an externality, a positive externality that we should encourage. So I think that's first principle. Second is, how I'm going to break up Facebook, exactly what that means. I think one of the first easiest steps would be really strong interoperability requirements so that we have multiple platforms and anyone can post on each other's platforms, just like we have with telephone companies. I mean, in the 1920s, we used to have independent telephone companies. And, if you remember from the old movies, I mean, I don't remember, but the history books, businessmen would have 3 telephones on the desk because there are separate telephone companies in large cities and they weren't interconnected. So they had to have different telephones. We could make the requirement that, Facebook has to interconnect with what's Trump's new social media company? Social. Yeah, why not? And
I guess I have one practical question about that. I mean, most of these social media platforms are different in format. Twitter is all about short 280 characters. Right. Facebook, you can post whatever length you want. TikTok is just videos. I mean, isn't the problem with interoperability on the posting side? I've heard that your friend list and stuff and who you follow, that's simpler in some ways. Isn't the problem with posting that each of these platforms is different in kind?
Yeah, I imagine that we've seen the same tech entrepreneurs put their ideas up, but there are platforms. I mean, I've seen technologies where you have multiple split screens where all of them appear at once, and certain windows, your interoperable window where you can sort of a universal posting where all of the things. I mean, things like Twitter would be difficult, but you could have, a Twitter box and you could easily post to them as you're posting elsewhere. These are technologies that could be imposed or introduced, I guess is the nicer word. And you talk about you talk about antitrust reform. I mean, that would really pull the rug from under them, because if the product is our eyeballs, well, then we make everyone's eyeballs available to everybody, and I think that would really be the best way to slay the vampire.
Yeah, and this sort of thing exists already when companies want it to exist, right? So like when Facebook bought Instagram, all of a sudden and I mean, I haven't had Instagram on my phone in like a year, but last I recall, like when you post on Instagram, you can also hit this button that says share to Facebook. Yeah. And the format is a little different, but like when they want it to work, they make it work.
Right.
In fact, it was the default. Like I remember I had to turn it off as a default because of like these random pictures with no caption.
Yeah, exactly.
Now I would say if we imposed it, they would also find a way to make it work.
Yeah. I mean, there's corollaries in this is really ancient history, but when I was your age, this is the issues that I would work on. The Part 69 of the FCC regulations. The wire, the jack, the phone jack. That's a regulatory artifact. And, the FCC said, okay, we're going to interconnect, and these are the engineering requirements. And you can put a telephone, you can put a fax machine, you can put all a ticker tape, you can put all sorts of things into that jack. We don't care. But that's going to be the interface. And I think that if we're creative, we can move to those sort of solutions. But again, the political economy, with those missiles coming over from Bezos's mansion in Kalorama, will make it very difficult. So
yeah, I want to go back to and pick up on your point about small businesses. You said our libertarian friends. We don't have to lie and call them our friends. They have kind of presented themselves as, in past decades as having the mantle of small business owners, right? But I think a lot of this big tech stuff shows how little they care. I mean, every time, I drive by a Whole Foods and I see all these like Amazon workers packing people's groceries, and like my wife and I are going to the farmer's market on the weekends to like buy all our meat from this guy that comes from like, West Virginia to sell his grass-fed beef or whatever. I mean, we are basically living in like a serf mindset. Yep. I mean, it's kind of insane. I suppose, my question here is, how can conservatives, true conservatives, because I don't think libertarianism is really included in that, how they can be picking up this, mantle of supporting small business owners. Because I don't think it's like a boomer thing to like want to protect small businesses. I think they're the backbone of communities and thus of society. But what are the best ways that we can kind of support them against these big tech companies that are basically trying to drive them from existence?
Well, one is a more serious antitrust, and that requires us as real conservatives to get smarter on it and more intelligent, because they do have the intellectual advantage on us, and
they've just bought off more law professors.
Yeah, well, well, yes. I mean, at some level, I mean, that means that we have to work hard and make sure that we get briefs to appellate judges to get some of the really bad ideas out of their heads. That's number one. I think number two, and this is something where I think a real coalition can be made, is that when I look at what goes by the name of libertarianism in the city, it's really corporate libertarianism.
And hedonism.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. It's sort of like Christopher Lash's The Revolt of the Elites. It's sort of like, we can do whatever we want. We don't care if everyone else is on meth. And so
digital meth.
I think I read that in Reason Magazine.
Yes, exactly. That's right. And but there is one area that I think is, and it has to do with farmers markets. So my wife owns a cookie business, and she's awesome. She teaches. she teaches. She sells at this farmers market.
I'm gonna get the link to that.
It's Dolce ItalianBakehouse.com.
That's so cool.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We're seriously gonna buy some.
And the regulatory requirements, and this is something very dangerous. The regulatory requirements for small businesses are much, much harder to bear than for big businesses because they can't, of course, spread the cost of compliance over all their customers. And I really think that's an area where there's a coalition to be made to be much more conscious of regulation and the anti-competitive effect upon regulation, because it's clear big businesses can handle it and smaller businesses can't. And if we want to encourage that, it's something we can. But again, most of what goes by the name of libertarianism in this town, I think, is more corporate libertarianism, which means, more beneficial policies for huge corporations.
Well, and also like concern trolling. So like, I mean, they've gotten really blatant over the last few years, but it's very rare that even the corporate libertarians in this town actively champion themselves as the defenders of these giant companies. They usually say, oh, the reason we need Section 230 is because it helps small businesses. Your forum on your small news site can't handle actual moderation requirements, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if you look at where all their funding's coming from, and if you look at, the way they immediately just start laughing the second you try to create alternatives to these big platforms, you realize, oh, okay, you guys are just oligarchic sops. But, a true desire to support small businesses in kind of a Jeffersonian way would be a way that maybe a more folk libertarianism would be able to rise. And this is why I have a ton of respect for someone like Thomas Massey, who genuinely does seem to care about this stuff. I mean, during COVID, when we had meat shortages, he wasn't saying we should deregulate these massive foreign meat companies. His bill, the Prime Act, would basically supported small U.S. beef producers. Great, awesome. The one good libertarian in Washington. But
Hamilton behind you is cringing that you reference Jefferson.
Yeah, I know. It's fine.
I mean, basically, what these libertarians are for, they're like for libertarianism for Fortune 500 companies and like serfdom for everybody else.
That's right.
Like it's not actual libertarianism.
Right.
But anyway, right. Adam, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
A lot of fun.
How can people keep up with your work and read
and your
more?
wife's cookie business?
Yeah.
Well, actually, she's on sabbatical right now. She's spending more time on our domestic cooking, from what I hear. So I'm very happy with that. But actually, she'll be back at the Okemos Farmers Market in Okemos, Michigan, in the spring. Yeah. So any of your viewers are there. But the website DolceItalianBakehouse.com. Look on SSRN for my articles. I'm not on social media. I really dislike it. And so that's the only thing I can say. Download my law review articles. I know that sounds the most boring thing in the world, but I don't do social media. I don't like it. And sorry. So
yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you for everything that you do, for being the wealth of knowledge that you are. And thank you for coming on Moment of Truth.
A real pleasure and honor. Thank you.
Adam really is pretty brilliant, or Professor Candeub, as I am tempted to call him, although he insisted that I call him Adam. As always, you can find everything about what American Moment is doing on our website at americanmoment.org. If you found this tech stuff interesting, there's a ton of other stuff we've posted, podcasts, essays, YouTube videos, short pieces on this topic. And at this point, we've probably had 5 or 6 guests that have just talked about this tech issue. It's something we're certainly focusing on. And if you're looking to think more about it, to read more about it, to listen to more about it, you can always find more about that on americanmoment.org. And if you're looking to actually get tangibly involved, americanmoment.org/fellowship. That's where you can apply for the Fellowship for American Statecraft. That's our flagship program where we pay young people to get their first job in Capitol Hill or at a nonprofit organization here in D.C. I've gotten hundreds of applications already, and we hope that you'll be one of them. We're not looking for the establishment credentials that everyone else is. We're looking for talented, capable, hardworking people who want to get into the fight. As always, please make sure to rate and review this podcast. It really helps us out. I know that you probably hear that on tons of podcasts, but thankfully a lot of you, hundreds of you, have stepped up to do so. Here, let's get to, 1,000 reviews this year. That'd be awesome if it could happen. And we're publishing this podcast on all sorts of platforms, Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, obviously, but also on Rumble and Getter and other places. So wherever you prefer to get your podcasts, or if you want to see our lovely mugs, you can go onto the video platforms. Be sure to check it out, repost the clips we post and everything. At ammoment.org is usually how you can find us on basically any platform. So thank you guys as always for listening, and we hope you'll join us next week for another episode of Moment of Truth. Moment of Truth is an American Moment Studios production filmed at the Conservative Partnership Center. Our podcast is produced and edited by Jake Mercier and Jared Cummings. Our intro music is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich. Don't forget to like and subscribe on all platforms, and you can go to AmericanMoment.org to learn more.